I started a new segment on the show a couple weeks ago that you guys seemed to like, so we're going to do another edition of it. It's called Who Covered It Best? Thank you to the founding sponsor of unDivided, 1530 Mortgage. Visit them at 1530mortgage.com. As you know, this past week, the United States Senate confirmed a new Supreme Court Justice, Ketanji Brown Jackson, and there's no doubt that her confirmation to the nation's highest court is historic by any measure. She is the first Black woman ever to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court. She hasn't taken her position as a justice yet, but will. And don't get me wrong, that is absolutely something in the coverage of her confirmation that is incredibly important to discuss, to talk about the implications of, to talk about the historic nature of. But I couldn't help but wonder how some of the main network newscasts covered her confirmation and how much of a focus they actually put on identity, that being the fact that she's Black and the fact that she's a woman, as opposed to other aspects of the story. What are the implications for the nation's highest court and for upcoming cases? What are her qualifications for the job? What are some of the political implications? And so let's do this. We're going to compare how the three network nightly newscasts covered this story. So that includes the NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt, ABC World News Tonight with David Muir, and the CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell. And these are, of course, straightforward newscasts, and this is how much of the country gets its news, especially, I think, the older generation and sort of middle America, very used to sitting down at night watching the evening newscast. And also, I would argue that people who consume news exclusively through the network newscasts like this are probably not people who are soaking in this news all the time. So they're not on Twitter and Facebook and getting their news from a variety of sources. This might be the only newscast that they get this information from. And so in that sense, it's really important that these newscasts, when they cover a story like this, do so holistically to give viewers a good understanding of the takeaways. So I divided, each of them had obviously a story about the confirmation on their newscast. And I wanted to look at some key aspects of what I think, again, this is my opinion, of what I think the coverage of Ketanji Brown Jackson's Supreme Court nomination should include. So when I looked at this coverage, I looked at it through the lens of five things. Identity. I do believe that there ought to be, and there probably should be, some coverage of the historic nature of the vote and of her nomination and of her confirmation. We've never had a Black woman on the Supreme Court before. It's a big deal. Obviously, there needs to be some coverage of the politics of it, how the vote shook out, and the political back and forth of the confirmation process. Most important, I think, are the implications. For the average American, what does Ketanji Brown Jackson's placement on the U.S. Supreme Court mean for important cases that the court is going to hear, or for the ideological makeup of the court, for instance? These are things that everyday Americans need to know. Fourth, qualifications. What are her qualifications for the job? Again, if you are an average American who watches maybe just the nightly news and you're not consuming a lot of media in other places, you might not have followed every second of the confirmation hearings to have a good understanding of who is this woman? What are her qualifications for the job? So it's important that these stories include that. And then I also have a category that's other, and this is sort of the pomp and circumstance of the day, other tidbits about the confirmation hearing. These are things that are important to include, help you understand the confirmation, what happened that day, but aren't one of the big takeaways. Let's start with NBC Nightly News. The anchor, of course, Lester Holt. The reporter in this case was Peter Alexander. Let's take a look at what things Peter prioritized in his report. So you'll see the biggest chunk of time, 55 seconds, was spent on identity. Those are things like her race and her gender. And I'm honestly not disappointed by that. And you'll kind of see how this shakes out in comparison to other reports, but you have to spend some time on the identity aspect of this, the fact that this is a historic Supreme Court confirmation. So it is a big deal. It should account for a big chunk of the time, but let's look at where it sits in comparison to other things. Only 15 seconds spent on the politics of it in Peter's report, 10 seconds on the implications. So not a ton of time on the implications, but what's important there is the fact that the court's ideological makeup actually isn't going to change with Ketanji Brown Jackson's confirmation. She's replacing another liberal justice. You don't have to spend a lot of time talking about the implications, but you do need to mention it for viewers who aren't in the know. No time, though, in this NBC Nightly News report spent on her qualifications for the job. Wasn't mentioned at all. And so if you're a viewer just coming into it, you might be wondering, well, I don't really know a lot about this woman. Can you tell me a little bit more about her besides the fact that she's Black? And then 45 seconds in this report spent on other tidbits of the day and the president's reaction and things like that. Okay, let's move on to ABC World News Tonight with David Muir. Really identity heavy. 2 minutes, more than half of this report. The correspondent is Rachel Scott. More than 2 minutes of her report was about identity. I felt like it was way too much. I mean, identity dominated the report at the expense of other information that wasn't included. Politics, again, 15 seconds of politics. I don't think that's a big deal. You just basically talk about here's how Republicans voted, here's how Democrats voted, not a big deal. No time spent in this report on the implications. No explanation to viewers at all that this isn't going to change the ideological makeup of the court, which I do think is important to at least mention. 5 seconds spent on qualifications, but this, I think, was me being generous. There was a brief mention that Ketanji Brown Jackson clerked for Stephen Breyer, which I guess speaks to her qualifications, but it was a very quick mention in passing. So again, giving them 5 seconds on that is pretty generous. And then other reporting about the day, 1 minute and 5 seconds. So you will see the vast majority of quote unquote substance in this ABC World News Tonight report was about identity, race, and gender, not qualifications, not implications. Okay, let's move on to the CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell, the correspondent, in this case, Jan Crawford. Again, a big chunk of it spent on identity. Watching it, I didn't think it was such a big deal, talking about the historic nature and what it's going to mean for the number of women on the court and the number of Black justices as well. 35 seconds spent on politics. That level felt appropriate to me in the conversations. And you'll see pretty good mix of stuff in this particular story. 30 seconds spent on the implications. And that included a soundbite from Republicans about why they opposed her nomination in terms of what they believe she'll bring to the court. And so I filed that under implications. And so I thought that that was good information. 15 seconds spent on her qualifications. It was an actual true layout of why she is qualified for the job beyond the identity politics of it. And then 35 seconds for other tidbits that were mixed in there as well. Overall, I don't watch the CBS Evening News very often, but I thought that this report was actually pretty good and pretty fair and placed the right focus on the right things for the right amount of time. So if I have to rate these, and again, this is my opinion, the CBS Evening News report was by far the best report because it had the best mix of information and it included the key information for Americans to take away with a full understanding of what Ketanji Brown Jackson's nomination and confirmation actually means for Americans. Number 2, NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt. I really thought Peter Alexander's story was good. I thought it had a good mix, again, of identity versus politics versus other important information. It was light on the implications, though, the takeaways for Americans. And then very obvious, for me at least, whose report was the worst, and that was World News Tonight with David Muir. Huge focus on identity. Again, it's important to include that stuff. It's a historic moment, but that doesn't mean that you spend 2 minutes, more than half of the time, talking about that and completely ignoring the implications of having a new Supreme Court justice and what it means for everyday Americans. So, CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell comes out on top when it comes to the confirmation of Ketanji Brown Jackson as the next U.S. Supreme Court Justice. And in case you're curious and you want to watch all these stories for yourself, I've included a link to them in the description of this segment. Thank you to the founding sponsor of unDivided, 1530 Mortgage. Visit them at 1530mortgage.com.